Hi, and good morning. Welcome to another video. If you notice, I've been doing kind of a lot of videos lately, and the reason why I've been doing a lot of videos lately is I've really kind of grown to like making videos. A lot of YouTubers have talked about this before. Once you start making videos, once you kind of get the ball rolling with that, start making a lot, and I think that's kind of what's happened to me because, I'll mention more of this in an upcoming video most likely. But now with things like YouTube, you could make videos and you could have a platform to get your ideas across, is where in the past you just didn't have that. Now you do have that, and you could be heard by, people all over the world, essentially. But what I want to do a video on today is I want to try to attempt to answer the question of what is smart? What is smart? That's a very interesting thing to talk about because I think it's very difficult to define. It's actually not that easy to actually say what smart is. People oftentimes seem to act like they know, and you'll hear people on different YouTube channels or other places around the internet where people will try to tackle this question. And some people tackle it pretty well. Some people seem to kind of struggle with it. So, yeah, that's what I want to talk about. Now, when it comes to intelligence, you have something called the Flynn effect. That's the first thing I want to mention. This concept called the Flynn effect, something that I've heard about recently. And what the Flynn effect states is that because of technology and the fact that we're bombarded by a lot more information nowadays, that people are essentially getting smarter. That's what the Flynn effect states. Because, you could go on the internet, you could go on YouTube, you could go on Wikipedia, or you could listen to podcasts, and you could get information that in the past would be more difficult to get. But now, instantly, you can get information about all kinds of topics. Is where, like I said, in the past, that would have been more difficult. So Flynn has said that because of that, and people have essentially been getting smarter. And I heard he used some examples. I know he was talking about how in the past, intelligence and whatnot, and the way people thought was a bit different to some degree, in that there was a lot more kind of straightforward kind of thought, or people would think in concretes a lot more. For example, be like, go hunt the deer, go fishing and catch some fish. There's a hole in the bucket, fix it. The roof is leaking, fix that. So things that were a lot more straightforward, not as abstract, very concrete. These things are very concrete. But now you also have a lot more kind of abstract thinking going around. On the internet, and there's a problem with a computer. Got to kind of think in more abstract terms. Sometimes, I know that can be very frustrating. But, yeah, there has been a change in that. So, the question of whether or not kids are getting smarter because of technology, yeah, you could say that. I guess, in a way, maybe yes and no. Because, for example, and here's an example I could use, when you write, you now have something called spell check that could correct your spelling. Well, as a result of spell check, a person might not make themselves a better speller because of that. Another example, we have GPSs now. A lot of people have a GPS in their car, right? So because of that, now people may not read maps or really learn how to read maps. So it's kind of a double-edged sword when it comes to technology. As you do gain stuff, you could lose some stuff as well. So that's kind of an interesting concept I kind of wanted to throw out. I mean, Flynn effect, in one way, does kind of, I think, enhance people. But then there always are some skills and some things that could be lost as a result of the technology, right? But Yes, and I remember I heard Flynn just giving some interview, and I want to say it might have been a podcast. He was talking about how when he went home from college, he got into an argument with his dad, and it ended kind of with him saying to his dad, well, how would you like it if you were black? And his dad was like, well, that couldn't happen. How could I be black? That couldn't happen. That would be impossible for that to happen to me, what you're saying. There would be no way. So he was saying that his dad was incapable of thinking hypothetically because what he did day to day, his job and the tasks he performed, he would never access that part of the brain to think hypothetically. So, he just was kind of incapable of thinking along those lines. But nowadays you have more people thinking hypothetically. Another thing in education nowadays, kind of the big buzzword is, critical thinking, and, teachers throwing that around, be, critical thinkers. And I don't always know necessarily what they're trying to get at with that, because it seems to me that when you do get someone to think very critically about stuff, they could start questioning the way things are done more, and they'll ultimately probably end up questioning the validity of the public school system itself, right? I mean, there could be you could become kind of problematic, I think, with critical thinking. I mean, that's certainly something that could happen, and yet that's the buzzword now in education, to get kids to think critically. But it makes you wonder, do teachers really want them to then think critically? So, that's that's kind of interesting right there. And I know I used to have conversations with teachers a while back. I was fascinated by doing this, where I would talk to teachers who had 30-plus year teaching careers, and I would always ask them, are the students of today different from the students when you started teaching 30-plus years ago? This fascinated me. I really wanted to know this, and I know one teacher I talked to told me that there's no difference at all. What changes is technology, but the students themselves, they don't change. They remain unchanging. They're the same, the same way they've always been. It's just, they may live under different social circumstances now. For example, maybe both parents work. So in that regard, things have changed. But other than that, no, they really haven't changed. Another one kind of did mention, and seemed to hint at kind of a Flynn effect thing, where he said that, yes, things have been changing. It used to be the student would come to school and they wouldn't have anything. They wouldn't have any information. It was the teacher's job to sort of fill their mind with knowledge and information. But nowadays, kids come to school with knowledge and information already in their head. Sometimes it could be weird, things that they found, strange things they found on the internet, but they are coming with stuff. They're coming with, different kinds of things, and, there's more options now in the internet, with the internet. I know around the time the internet started, back in the days when they used to call the internet the information superhighway, a lot of times when people would do research on something, it would come with kind of a lot of what seemed like a gobbledygook, sort of different kind of weird things from different places that didn't seem to gel right. But now there's just more stuff on the internet, and there's more good information on the internet. So, you don't really see that as much as you used to. But, yeah, fascinating stuff. Another teacher told me that, when he, if I asked him the question of were students, different, 25 years ago, he would have answered it completely different than today, because he seemed to kind of hint at the fact that there's more of what you would call helicopter parenting today than what you had in the past. And, that's where things have really changed significantly. So, yeah, just, some interesting perspectives there. And, IQ and all that, and IQ isn't necessarily a very modern term right now, but it is kind of an interesting thing to talk about, and the mind is an interesting thing to talk about. There's a lot of mind myths out there. The one mind myth I know of is that mind myth that we as human beings only use 10% of our brain, right? That we only use 10% of our brain, and, what's the other 90% used for? We only use, it's the classic weed conversation, right? We only use 10% of our brain, man. What do we use the other 90% for? Telepathy. It's that kind of classic conversation like that, when they know full well what we use the brain for. For example, I think vision alone accounts for 30% of the brain, so they know that. But, I saw this movie recently that kind of went along with that mind myth. The movie was called Lucy. It's one of those movies with, the title is like a person's first name, those kinds of movies, like, Lucy, Carrie, Patrick, Jennifer. Immediately the movie's going to be about somebody with psychic powers, right? Just by the title. And with Lucy, I think she could use like 100% of her brain. But what I'm saying is that whole, we only use 10% of our brain thing is kind of a myth from what I've heard, because what had happened was, like, a little over 100 years ago, a self-help guru came out with a book that stated that human beings only reach 10% of their full potential. Just 10% of their full potential. And, the other 90%, they don't. They only reach 10%. Now, that got misconstrued and misinterpreted completely to mean mind. But that's not what was said. What was said was that people only use 10% of their full, only reach 10% of their full potential. When, what ended up happening was, like I just said, people misinterpreted that for meaning mind. It was completely different. That's not what was said. What was said was, like I just said, people only reach 10% of their full potential. But yeah, people completely misinterpreted that as meaning mind, as meaning, brain. And that was what happened there. So that's definitely kind of interesting to throw out there, because that is definitely one of the mind myths that you have. And I know with like IQ in general, like I just said, IQ's not really the most, modern term anymore. And people still do talk of it, but kind of don't really hear about it as much anymore. Now, people will talk about other things too, like EQ. But I know with IQ, I believe like around 100 years ago, there was a French scientist who came up with the whole, IQ concept. And the average IQ, according to him, was 100. And that was the average IQ of the average French person at that time. But later, I think it kind of meant the average IQ of the average European. So all of France, all of England, all of Spain, all of Russia. So all that kind of got thrown into it. And, 100 became like the standard of an IQ. So that right there is also kind of interesting as well. Now, in the 90s, there was a book that came out on EQ, and that talks about one's emotional intelligence. This gets a little complicated and a little tricky because, this book, and the controversy kind of around it was that there wasn't a lot of documentation or a whole lot of kind of like research in this book. And it just kind of stated that, people who become, more successful have more of a highly developed EQ or interpersonal type skills. And, that gets kind of complicated because, here you could kind of make the argument that someone with a high IQ can easily learn all the nuances of communication and all that, and then EQ kind of becomes IQ. Like that's a part of it. Because if someone has a high IQ, they could easily pick up all that, those social cues and all that kind of stuff. They would be able to do that, better than, someone who doesn't, And it's kind of interesting when you talk about, emotional intelligence and all that. I once heard someone referred to as I once heard someone referred to as socially gifted. And all the person really seemed to excel at, from what I could tell, was kind of like small talk kind of things. Like they were good at sort of like small talk kind of conversation. I didn't see how they were really like socially gifted, and I didn't really see how being really good at small talk makes someone socially gifted, but yet they were referred to as such. So, yeah, just some, fascinating things, all the way around, when you talk about intelligence and IQ and just the different theories around it and what smart is. Because here's another interesting thing about smart. For example, you could take a guy like Einstein, and he's smart in the thing he does, but you could take Einstein and maybe put him on a construction site or an auto body shop or something like that, and people working there might call him stupid, right? Because, his, knowledge and his, intellect is not, in that area. So a guy like that could be referred to as stupid, even though, of course, he's not. He's got, knowledge in this other area, but because, he's doing something he's, unfamiliar with, and he hadn't done before, people are saying that he's not smart, and definitely probably have some of that. I remember one time I had worked someplace, and I remember there was a guy said that, I'm the smartest person who works here. And I was kind of like, well, how do you figure that? And all I could really kind of tell was, seemed to be able to do things at a fast pace, and he had real good reaction time. But is that smart? Is that doing things fast and having a good reaction time when you do them because you're a young guy? So yeah, that's interesting too. I really don't know if you would call that smart or not. So I'm saying, smart and what smart is certainly, can be kind of difficult to define. Just so many different ways you could define it. I know in a lot of teacher education programs nowadays, teachers would be